Okay, I've been building up to it, the movement disorders. A couple of things you're going to notice with this set of PowerPoints is that there is a change in sound quality back and forth. So some of this I created in the spring of 2020. I had a different laptop where the sound quality was better, but everything else was worse. It took me a lot longer. There were a lot of things that did not work very well. So I'm switching to this other laptop. Also, though, I had gotten to know my class that semester, and I think I refer here to spring break and things that had happened that semester. And I'm just going to leave some of it as it is, since some of this is complicated and it takes a lot of mental effort for me to go back through. And if it sounds good enough, I'm leaving it. Okay, so these are the structures that are part of the basal ganglia. You can click on the yellow link there to, I think it's Khan Academy, and I think it is the direct pathway, the description of the direct pathway, and then what you'll see to the right is that there's also a description of the indirect pathway. I'm going to quickly give a description of the direct pathway. Okay, and we went over this briefly in class before spring break, and I'm just going over it again briefly because it helps to make sense of the movement disorders and what's going on. So the direct pathway, what's happening here is we have the substantia nigra, they're communicating to the striatum. We also have, so I decide to make a movement and my motor cortex communicates to the striatum. So the striatum includes the caudate nucleus and the putamen. You can see them over to the far right. They are actually, what they're doing is inhibiting an inhibitor in the direct pathway. So what's usually happening, if you look over to your left at the thalamus is doing a lot of communication with the motor cortex. And so if we weren't inhibiting this, we would just be kind of moving all the time. But what we're doing is we're inhibiting this with the globus pallidus internal. So the globus pallidus internal has a lot of spontaneous activity, and it is inhibiting all of this possible motor movement. Okay, because the motor cortex, I decide the movement that I'm going to make, but there are also neurons that are then communicating, right? Communicating on to the neurons, to the motor neurons in the spinal cord. Okay, so what I'm doing when I decide to make a movement consciously is that I'm inhibiting that inhibitor. So the striatum is inhibiting the inhibition of the globus pallidus internal, which is allowing me to make the movement. Okay, I'm ceasing to inhibit the movement that I consciously, voluntarily want to make. That's the direct pathway. The indirect pathway is more complex, and I'm not going to describe it to that same extent. But what it's basically doing is indirectly inhibiting the inhibition of the inhibitor. And so what it's doing is it is stopping the inappropriate movement. So when I make a movement, I want to make a specific movement, and I don't want to make a lot of inappropriate movements. And that's part of what the indirect pathway is helping me do. But I'm going to ignore that for now. So if we look at the movement disorders, what's going on in the basal ganglia, it makes sense of the kind of movement disorders that we end out with. So Parkinson's disease is specifically caused by a loss of those neurons in the substantia nigra. So those neurons that are sending dopamine into this system, both excitatory and inhibitory information going into the striatum. So some of the symptoms that occur are rigidity and muscle tremors. Some of those movements that we really don't want, and messages to our muscles that we don't want, but also slow movements and difficulty initiating physical movements. So anything where I have to make a spontaneous movement where I'm consciously, voluntarily choosing to move in the absence of something external guiding my action, that becomes more difficult. In addition to, there's also, if you remember, when we very early on talked about the basal ganglia, it's not just motor activity and that kind of procedural memory. Procedural memory includes this kind of learning of patterns, and it involves some cognitive reasoning. So other symptoms include reasoning deficits and other cognitive deficits and memory deficits that include that kind of procedural memory. Symptoms also include people often have some depression, which is understandable considering they know what's going on and what's happening with them. They also, early on, often have a severe loss of olfaction, which makes it clear that especially if there's any predisposition, that this is something that is occurring in their life, that they have Parkinson's. Again, one of the main cause of Parkinson's, what's happening at the substantia nigra. We'll talk about how exactly this is occurring, how much there is a predisposition versus environmental influences, but we have this gradual progressive death of the neurons in the substantia nigra. So this really low-level midbrain structure that produces dopamine to send into this system. So a treatment that has been around for decades, really, for Parkinson's disease is L-DOPA. It crosses the blood-brain barrier, which dopamine itself does not. It's a precursor to dopamine, so we can create dopamine from L-DOPA. If you go back to your biosynthesis, this is one of the intermediate steps after the original amino acids to create dopamine. I have on here a link. This is a link that I hope you all watch. This is Michael J. Fox talking about his own Parkinson's, showing some of the symptoms and what he goes through, as well as providing some advocacy, which he has been doing for a couple decades now since he realized that he had Parkinson's. Your author goes through a number of different treatments because L-DOPA is not ideal. It is creating the release of dopamine in other dopaminergic pathways. It causes side effects, sometimes hallucinations, delusions. So one of the things that is that they've tried more recently is transplanting stem cells or small structures in the brain. And he goes through several of those different kinds of treatments. The only one I'm going to talk about other than L-DOPA is this deep brain stimulation. It's a treatment for Parkinson's that looks very promising, and that they're actually trying on humans. All the other ones have been on animal models. So they do the deep brain stimulation. I can't remember how much exactly we talked about it, but they're going in and they're exciting or stimulating particular neurons. And you can see what they've marked here in this picture is the thalamus. I assumed it would be the substantia nigra, but I guess because those neurons are actually degenerating and we're losing them completely, that what they want to stimulate is the thalamus. And I have had at least one student talk about, I think it was her grandfather, and tell me how much this was helping to slow the progression of Parkinson's. If we go back to the question of what causes Parkinson's, clearly it is the loss of these neurons in the substantia nigra, but the question is what's causing that? And so they have identified at least 28 genes that predispose somebody to having Parkinson's. If you get one of these genes, maybe even two of these genes, you probably don't have a lot of chance of developing Parkinson's, but the more genes you have, the more likely it is that you're going to develop Parkinson's disease. There's also an environmental component to all of this, where if you're exposed to pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, any of those kinds of toxins, you're more likely to have Parkinson's disease. One of the reasons they've even looked towards environment and towards toxins was from an incident back in 1982 in Northern California, where some young people took synthetic heroin that had this chemical in it, this MPTP, which is an abbreviation for a very long chemical name, and that becomes in the body MPP+, which is another really long chemical name, and that chemical destroys those neurons in the substantia nigra, which had them looking towards more environmental causes. Also, interestingly, I think, there are correlations. So there's a correlation that the more people smoke, the less likely they are to get Parkinson's disease. There is a there's a balance between dopamine and some of these other neurotransmitter systems. And one of them is dopamine with acetylcholine. And nicotine is an acetylcholine agonist. So Smoking apparently lessens your chance of getting Parkinson's disease, but I would not recommend, if you have Parkinson's disease in your family, to go start smoking cigarettes, since many other disorders and diseases are correlated with smoking, not just lung cancer and other types of cancers, but other disorders as well. The other thing that's correlated with Parkinson's is drinking coffee with not getting Parkinson's. So the more coffee, the first time I read about it, it was somebody said, one of the textbooks said, the people who drank between 3 to 5 cups of coffee a day were less likely to get Parkinson's disease. Your book says people who are drinking 10 cups of coffee a day are less likely to get Parkinson's disease. For me, that's a lot of coffee. So if I drink more than 2 cups of coffee a day, I'm like a squirrel on crack up in front of my students, so that's never going to happen. But apparently, the more coffee you drink, the less likely you are to get Parkinson's disease. The other movement disorder that's discussed in your textbook is Huntington's disease, sometimes known as Huntington's chorea. Chorea means to dance, as they are, which is a pretty pejorative term to discuss how these people will have a lot of unwanted movement. So early on, they're going to have some jerks and twitches and things, but that's going to spread to other parts of the body and develop into writhing. Eventually, they'll also have a similar kind of problem as people with Parkinson's, where they are having difficulty with voluntary movements like walking and speaking and typing and other things like that. They also have that lack of ability to learn and improve new movements and some of those cognitive deficiencies that come from the kind of procedural memory that's being lost because of the loss of the basal ganglia. They also, often before we even see these movement symptoms, have a host of possible psychological disorders, including depression, problems with their sleep, memory impairment, anxiety, short fuse, kind of irritation. They can have hallucinations and delusions, make poor judgment. They often have some alcoholism, some kind of substance abuse problems, and they have sexual disorders ranging from a complete lack of interest and kind of apathy towards sex to being overly sexualized. What causes Huntington's disease? Again, we see it is the basal ganglia and damage to the basal ganglia, which gradually we see a loss of neurons, and this time not in the substantia nigra that are feeding into the basal ganglia system, but in the striatum. So these pictures are showing, which is they're slightly different than your textbook. Your textbook is actually much more disturbing, as those are real human cadaver brains, but this is more idealized, and you can see on the right in B that the lateral ventricles are physically larger because of the neurons around the ventricles have died off. Okay, they've been damaged and they're gone. The question, just like with Parkinson's, is, well, what causes that? And with Huntington's disease, this appears to be completely genetic. It is an autosomal dominant gene. So somebody who has a parent who has Huntington's disease has a 50% chance of getting Huntington's disease. They do have a test for it now, and the question is, do you want to test and find out that you have this debilitating disorder that will most likely kill you within 15 years, or do you want to live your life and not know until you start to see the symptoms? They discovered the protein Huntington from Huntington's disease, and in its mutant form, Huntington just impairs, it's throughout the body, but it just impairs the brain and the mitochondria and potassium in neurons. What's happening is that on chromosome 4, we all have a number of repeats of cytosine, adenine, guanine. So those nucleotides repeat typically between 11 and 24 times. If they repeat up to about 35, 36 times, you're safe from Huntington's. But if they repeat more than 35 times, you have some amount of chance of getting Huntington's. And the more they repeat, so they're actually coding for glutamine. And so the more repeats of this coding for glutamine that people have, the more likely they are to get Huntington's, and the more likely it is to be severe, and the younger that they're likely to get it. So your author has a couple of graphs and pictures that show this relationship between the number of repeats and how young someone is when they get the disease and when they get other kinds of diseases as well. My very last slide is another link. So I think for both of these movement disorders, they're very interesting, and it's important to see them kind of side by side. And so I will recommend, again, that you go back and watch Michael J. Fox with his Parkinson's disease, and that you watch some of this link of this doctor who has Huntington's disease, so that you can see how these differ, really. I don't usually show this whole link. I usually show about 7 or 8, maybe 9 minutes of this. And this is usually where we end talking about movement disorders, where I start asking students. So think about what you see as far as what's similar and what's different between people who have these disorders.